Before Canada existed as a country, before the British planted their flag, before the French paddled their first canoe down the St. Lawrence, before any European ever laid eyes on this land, there was a civilization here. Not a loose collection of wandering tribes stumbling through the wilderness. A civilization. Cities with populations that dwarf medieval London. Political systems so sophisticated that the founding fathers of the United States openly borrowed from them. Trade networks stretching thousands of miles in every direction. Astronomical knowledge precise enough to orient entire cities toward the movements of the sun. Art so refined, it still stuns researchers who dig it out of the ground today. And then it was erased, not by time, not by mystery, not by some unsolved catastrophe that historians are still puzzling over. It was erased deliberately, systematically, and so completely that most Canadians today could not name a single one of the nations that ruled this land for thousands of years before their country was invented. This is that story. The land that became Canada is roughly 10 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, it is larger than the entire continent of Europe. For tens of thousands of years, every single corner of that land was known, mapped, managed, and inhabited by people who understood it with an intimacy that no modern nation has ever come close to replicating. These were not primitive people. The word primitive was invented by colonizers to justify what they were doing. These were engineers, astronomers, diplomats, farmers, architects, and philosophers. They built things that still stand. They made decisions that still echo. And the history of this continent cannot be honestly told without putting them exactly where they belong, which is at the very beginning and at the very center. So we are going to go back, way back, further than the history textbooks used in Canadian schools are willing to go. We are going to walk through the Ice Age migrations, the first settlements, the agricultural revolutions, the rise of confederacies, the construction of cities, the development of trade empires, the peak of indigenous civilization on this continent, and then we are going to look with clear eyes at exactly how and why all of it was systematically buried. Because here is the thing about erased history. It does not disappear. It waits underground. It waits in oral traditions. It waits in the genetic memory of communities that survived what was done to them. And increasingly, it waits in the findings of archaeologists, linguists, and historians who are finally beginning to tell the truth about what was here before Canada decided it owned this place. 14,000 years ago, give or take a millennium, the last great ice age was releasing its grip on North America. The Laurentide ice sheet, which had covered most of what is now Canada under a kilometer or more of glacial ice, was melting. It was retreating northward, and as it retreated, it revealed a land of extraordinary richness. River valleys flushing with meltwater, plains emerging from under the ice and exploding with vegetation, coastlines reshaping themselves year by year. And following all of this life, following the mammoths and the mastodons and the giant ground sloths and the herds of wild horses that no longer exist, were people. The question of exactly when and how the first humans arrived in the Americas has been one of the most intensely debated in all of archaeology. For decades, the accepted answer was the Clovis first theory. The idea that the first Americans walked across the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia around 13,000 years ago and spread rapidly through both continents. It was a clean, satisfying theory. It had a clear timeline. It fit neatly into the standard narrative of human migration. But the evidence kept complicating the story. Sites kept turning up that were older than Clovis, much older. In Monteverde, Chile, archaeologists found evidence of human habitation dating to 14,800 years ago, which means people were already in South America before Clovis. People supposedly arrived in North America. That is logistically impossible unless the Clovis first model is wrong. And so scientists went looking for alternatives. What they found was a far richer and more complex picture of human arrival. Multiple waves of migration, multiple routes, people who may have traveled down the Pacific coast by boat tens of thousands of years ago, hopping between ice-free refugia along the shoreline, arriving in the Americas far earlier than the Bering Land Bridge could account for. The genetic evidence now suggests that some lineages of indigenous North Americans have been on this continent for at least 20,000 years, and possibly much longer. In Canada specifically, the archaeological record pushes back further with every passing decade. At Charlie Lake Cave in British Columbia, evidence of human presence dates to 10,500 years ago. At Bluefish Caves in Yukon, possibly the oldest archaeological site in Canada, there are cut-marked bones and stone tools that may be 24,000 years old. 24,000 years. The University of Montreal has examined this evidence, and while debate continues about some of the oldest claims, the conservative estimate still places the first Canadians in this land many thousands of years before any European civilization was capable of building a boat that could reach them. These earliest peoples were Paleo-Indians. They are known today primarily through the tools they left behind, through bones that survived in the right conditions, and through what their descendants remember of them in oral tradition. They were hunters, certainly, but calling them only hunters misses what they actually were. They were naturalists of the highest order. They had to be. Survival in post-glacial North America required a depth of ecological knowledge that would stagger a modern biologist. They knew which plants flowered first in spring and what that signaled about the snowpack. They knew the migration patterns of dozens of species of animals across thousands of kilometers. They knew where the fish ran thick and when. They understood weather, geology, seasons, and landscape with a precision that came from living inside that world rather than apart from it. And crucially, they passed this knowledge on. For thousands of years, the oral tradition was the library, the database, the university, and the archive of these peoples. Stories were not just entertainment. They were information delivery systems, precision engineered to carry specific knowledge across generations in a form that could survive without paper or stone inscription. A story about a trickster who ignores the flooding of a river valley and loses everything was not just a moral tale. It was a hydrological record, a warning about a real river valley that actually flooded under specific conditions, embedded in a narrative structure that guaranteed it would be remembered and repeated accurately for generations. Researchers studying Indigenous oral traditions in the Pacific Northwest have found stories describing volcanic eruptions and coastal flooding events that match geological evidence of events that occurred 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years. The stories are that old. The knowledge survived that intact. No civilization in the ancient world had a more durable information preservation system than the oral traditions of North America's indigenous peoples. By around 8,000 years ago, the continental ice sheet had retreated enough that most of what is now Canada was ice-free and habitable. People spread across the landscape, adapting to wildly different environments as they went. The groups that settled on the Pacific coast developed cultures oriented around the extraordinary abundance of the ocean, the rivers, and the temperate rainforest. The groups that moved into the interior plains oriented their lives around the vast buffalo herds that covered the grasslands in numbers that are almost impossible to imagine today. Estimates suggest there were 30 to 60 million bison on the Great Plains at their peak. 60 million animals, each one weighing up to a ton, covering a landscape that stretched from what is now Texas to what is now Alberta. The peoples who lived among these herds did not simply hunt them. They managed them using fire, topography, and an intimate knowledge of animal behavior to direct herds, cull selectively, and maintain the health of populations they depended on. In the east, in the great deciduous and boreal forests that covered the land from the Atlantic coast to the prairies, groups organized around seasonal rounds of hunting, fishing, gathering, and eventually farming. These were not random wanderers following food. They were managing landscapes, setting prescribed burns to encourage the growth of specific plants, replanting harvested areas, cultivating wild varieties of useful plants, gradually domesticating some of them over centuries. The eastern woodlands were, in the most literal sense, a managed garden on a continental scale, and the peoples who managed it had been doing so for thousands of years before anyone thought to call it wilderness. Around 5,000 years ago, something began to change in the eastern half of the continent. The change was slow at first, subtle. Archaeologists see it first in the burial patterns. More elaborate graves, more goods placed with the dead, signs of social differentiation, signs that some individuals or families had accumulated more status, more wealth, more influence than their neighbors. This is the signature of a society becoming more complex, more hierarchical, more organized around surplus and specialization, rather than simple subsistence. This process accelerated dramatically around 3,000 years ago with the emergence of what archaeologists call the woodland tradition. The woodland peoples were not a single culture or a single ethnic group. They were a broad family of related cultures spread across the eastern half of North America, from the Gulf of Mexico to Hudson Bay, sharing certain technologies, certain artistic conventions, and most significantly, certain ceremonial practices centered on the burial of the dead in large earthen mounds. The mounds are the most visible legacy of these cultures, and they have been confusing and embarrassing European-descended scholars since the 18th century. When American and Canadian settlers began pushing into the interior of the continent and encountered these massive earthworks, hundreds and eventually thousands of them, some as large as 15 meters high and 100 meters across, they faced a choice. They could accept the evidence that indigenous peoples had built them, which would have complicated the narrative that this land was empty and available for settlement, or they could invent an alternative explanation. They chose the alternative explanation. For much of the 19th century, the dominant theory in American and Canadian scholarly circles was that the mounds had been built by a vanished race of non-indigenous people. Theories abounded. The lost tribes of Israel, Vikings, Atlanteans, ancient Egyptians, Phoenician traders. Some argued for a mythical civilization called the Mound Builders, a separate, superior race that had been wiped out by the bloodthirsty ancestors of the actual indigenous people. This theory was enormously convenient. It allowed settlers to position themselves not as invaders of indigenous land, but as avengers of a prior civilization, or simply as inheritors of a land whose true builders were already gone. The theory was also completely, demonstrably false. When the Smithsonian Institution finally sent trained archaeologists to investigate the mound systematically in the 1880s, they found exactly what the indigenous peoples had always said they would find: evidence that the mounds were built by the ancestors of living Native American and First Nations communities. The artifacts matched. The construction methods matched. The ceremonial objects matched items still in use by contemporary indigenous communities. The DNA of skeletal remains, where it has been analyzed, matches indigenous populations. The mounds were built by indigenous people. They were always built by indigenous people. Everyone who was paying honest attention already knew this, but the myth of the mound builders had already done its damage. It had embedded itself in popular culture, in school textbooks, in the national mythology of settler societies, and it was extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. Even today, versions of it persist in fringe archaeology, in conspiracy theories, in the kinds of pseudo-historical content that gets millions of views on platforms that do not fact-check anything. The truth about the mound-building cultures of North America is, if anything, more interesting than any of the myths. The Hopewell tradition, which reached its peak between about 100 BCE and 500 CE, was one of the most remarkable cultural phenomena in the ancient world. The Hopewell were not a single tribe or nation. They were a network, a vast, continent-spanning exchange network centered on the burial of high-status individuals with elaborately crafted grave goods made from materials that had traveled extraordinary distances to reach their resting places. Hopewell burial mounds in Ohio contain obsidian from Yellowstone, more than 2,000 kilometers to the west. They contain grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the deposits around Lake Superior, hammered into intricate shapes, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Appalachians cut into silhouettes of human hands and bird claws of stunning delicacy. Meteoric iron, rare enough that its presence in a burial suggests the individual who received it had extraordinary status. These were not random collections of exotic material. They were deliberate statements about connection, about reach, about the web of relationships that Hopewell communities maintained across the entire eastern half of the continent. In what is now Ontario, the Hopewell influence was strong. Sites along the north shore of Lake Erie and in the Grand River Valley show clear evidence of participation in the Hopewell Exchange Network. The intrusive mound culture and later the Princess Point culture, which emerged around 500 CE in the Western Lake Ontario Basin, were among the communities that bridged between the great Hopewell centers to the south and the hunter-gatherer societies of the Canadian Shield to the north. This is important because for a long time, Canadian archaeology tended to present the prehistory of the land as somewhat peripheral. The great civilizations were in Mexico, in Peru, in the American Southwest. Canada was presented as a land of hunter-gatherers, of small mobile bands surviving in harsh environments, without the large-scale social complexity that characterized the cultures to the south. This was always a partial picture, and modern archaeology is filling in what was missing. The Laurentian archaic peoples of what is now Ontario and Quebec, dating back 4,000 years or more, had trade networks stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes. They processed copper into tools and ornaments on an industrial scale. Their burial practices show sophisticated beliefs about the afterlife and the spiritual significance of specific materials. These were not simple subsistence societies. They were complex communities with rich symbolic lives and far-reaching economic connections. further east, the maritime archaic people of Labrador and Newfoundland were, by 7,000 years ago, among the most accomplished maritime hunters in the world. They hunted walrus and seal and small whales from boats sophisticated enough to take them far offshore. They processed harp seals in quantities that suggest coordinated, large-scale hunting drives requiring social organization and communication well beyond what a simple band of subsistence hunters would need. Their burial sites, particularly the extraordinary red ochre burials found at Port Oshawa in Newfoundland, reveal individuals adorned with thousands of carefully drilled shell beads, with carved bone tools, with beautifully worked stone. These were people who had time and energy to invest in aesthetics, in ceremony, in the creation of beauty. That is not the signature of people living on the edge of survival. That is the signature of abundance, management, and sophisticated social organization. By the time the woodland cultures were flourishing across eastern North America, the continent was not a wilderness. It was a managed, inhabited, politically organized landscape of enormous complexity. And then, somewhere around 800 CE, something happened that would transform it even further. Corn arrived in the north. Maize, to use its proper name, had been domesticated in Mexico thousands of years earlier. By the time it reached the Great Lakes Basin and the eastern woodlands of what is now Canada, it had already been refined through thousands of years of agricultural selection into dozens of varieties suited to different climates and growing conditions. The introduction of maize to the peoples of southern Ontario and the St. Lawrence Valley was transformative in ways that are difficult to overstate. Before maize, the peoples of this region lived primarily on a combination of hunting, fishing, and gathering, with some cultivation of native plants like sunflowers, goosefoot, and squash. Productive and reliable, but limiting in terms of how many people could be supported in a given area. Maize changed the equation entirely. A single hectare planted in maize could support far more people than the same hectare of forest used for hunting and gathering. Surplus food meant that not everyone needed to spend all of their time getting food. Some people could specialize. Some could devote themselves to craft production. Some could become specialists in ceremony, in governance, in diplomacy, in architecture, and some could become warriors, defending the surplus that everyone else now depended on. The agricultural revolution in the eastern woodlands was not a sudden transformation. It took centuries, but its effects were profound and visible in the archaeological record. Between about 500 CE and 1000 CE, settlement patterns shift. People begin congregating in larger groups. Villages appear, then larger villages, then, in some areas, something that has to be called a town. Longhouses, the extraordinary communal dwellings that would become one of the defining technologies of northeastern North American cultures, begin appearing in the archaeological record of southern Ontario around 900 CE. A longhouse is worth pausing on because it is a remarkable piece of engineering and a remarkable statement about how a society is organized. The longhouses of the peoples who would eventually form the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Wendat Confederacy were not simple shelters. They were communal apartment buildings. A single longhouse might be 50 meters long and 10 meters wide, framed in bent sapling poles, covered in sheets of elm bark, and housing anywhere from 30 to 60 people. Not just individuals, but entire families, matrilineally organized, the women of a related lineage occupying a single structure with their husbands, children, and elders. The fire pit hearths were shared. The stored food was shared. The decisions about the household were made collectively, with senior women holding primary authority over the domestic space and significant influence over who was chosen to fill positions of political leadership. Multiple longhouses gathered together formed a village. A village was surrounded by a palisade, a defensive wall of sharpened stakes in the most vulnerable periods. Around the village were the agricultural fields, tended by the women of the community, who over generations had developed one of the most sophisticated and productive agricultural systems in the ancient world. The Three Sisters. It is a beautiful name for a beautiful technology. Corn, beans, and squash, planted together in the same mound of earth. The corn grows tall and provides a structure for the beans to climb. The beans fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into the soil, fertilizing the corn and the squash. The squash spreads along the ground, its broad leaves shading out weeds and retaining moisture. 3 species, each one filling a role the others cannot, each one making the others more productive, together creating a self-sustaining agricultural system that produces more food per unit of land than any of the 3 could produce alone. This is not a happy accident. This is the product of thousands of years of observation, experimentation, and careful cultivation by women farmers who understood plant ecology at a depth that Western agricultural science only began to appreciate in the 20th century. By around 1000 CE, what is now southern Ontario was one of the most densely populated regions north of Mexico. Communities of hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 people, farming the rich soils of the lower Great Lakes Basin, fishing the extraordinary fisheries of the rivers and lakes, and developing increasingly elaborate systems of governance, ceremony, and diplomacy to manage the relationships between communities that were now close enough to compete and powerful enough to wage serious war. War. It is important to be honest about this. Pre-contact Indigenous North America was not a peaceful paradise. There was war. There was raiding. There was violence between communities. The palisades around Iroquoian villages were not decorative. The archaeological evidence of burned villages, of massacred populations, of individuals buried with projectile points embedded in their bones is real, and it tells a real story about conflict between communities, competing for land, for resources, for political dominance. But here is what is also true. The peoples of northeastern North America developed over centuries of conflict and diplomacy one of the most sophisticated and durable peacemaking systems the world has ever seen. And it began, according to tradition, with a man who walked across a lake. The founding of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is one of the great political stories in human history. It is told differently by different communities within the Confederacy, and the oral tradition preserves layers of meaning that resist reduction to a simple historical narrative. But the broad outline is this. At some point in the past, probably between 900 and 1450 CE, depending on which historical and archaeological evidence you credit, the nations of the northeastern woodlands were locked in a cycle of retaliatory violence that was destroying their communities. Mourning wars, conducted to replace members lost in battle or to disease, generated raids that generated counter-raids that generated more mourning and more war in an escalating spiral. Into this world came a man known in the oral tradition as the peacemaker. His name is considered too sacred to speak casually in many Haudenosaunee communities, and so he is referred to by his title. The peacemaker traveled among the warring nations with a message, a vision of a great peace, an end to retaliatory violence through the adoption of a new system, a constitutional system in which grievances could be addressed through counsel and law rather than through warfare. The peacemaker found an ally in a woman named Jagansasi, who was a leader among the neutral trade people of the western Iroquois territories. She became known as the Mother of Nations, and her role in the founding of the Confederacy was as significant as any male figure in the story. He found a second ally in a man named Hiawatha, who had lost his own daughters in the cycle of violence, and who became the peacemaker's most effective advocate, traveling from nation to nation, delivering the message of the Great Peace. The last and most difficult obstacle was a man known as Tatadaho. In some versions of the story, he is a sorcerer, a terrifying figure whose hair was said to be made of snakes, so twisted was his mind with malice and power. He was the greatest opponent of the new peace, but even Tatadaho was transformed. The peacemaker and Hiawatha combed the snakes from his hair, metaphorically straightened his twisted mind, and incorporated him into the new system. Tatadaho became not an enemy of the Confederacy, but its central ceremonial figure, a role that persists to this day in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is still an active political entity. The Great Law of Peace, the Gayanashagoa in the Onondaga language, is the constitution of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. It governed the political relations between the original 5 nations of the Confederacy, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cahokia, and the Seneca. A 6th nation, the Tuscarora, joined in the early 18th century. The Great Law is extraordinary. It is one of the most sophisticated political documents produced by any human civilization. It established a bicameral legislative structure with different nations having different roles and veto powers in the deliberative process. It enshrined the principle that leaders serve at the pleasure of the people, specifically at the pleasure of the senior women of the community, who had the power to remove a leader who failed to act in the community's interest. It established protocols for grievance resolution, for the adoption of outsiders into the Confederacy, for the conduct of warfare, and for the achievement of consensus decisions on matters of collective importance. Benjamin Franklin knew about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. He attended treaty conferences with Haudenosaunee leaders. He explicitly cited the Confederacy as a model when arguing for union among the American colonies. At the 1744 Lancaster Treaty Conference, Onondaga leader Kana Satego had directly advised the colonial delegates to unite under a Confederate system similar to the one the Haudenosaunee had used for centuries. The ideas in the United States Constitution, including the bicameral legislature, the federalist distribution of powers between central and local authorities, the mechanism for impeachment of leaders, have documented parallels in the Great Law of Peace that a growing body of scholarship has taken seriously, even as mainstream American history has been reluctant to credit. This is not a minor footnote. It is a central fact about the origin of democratic governance in North America. The continent's oldest democracy was not founded in Philadelphia in 1787. It was founded in the northeastern woodlands, possibly as many as 600 years earlier, by indigenous peoples who developed, through hard experience, a system of governance sophisticated enough that its basic principles are still recognizable in the political systems of modern nation-states. While the Haudenosaunee were developing and living under their Confederate Constitution, other indigenous civilizations across North America were at or near the peak of their development, and none was more spectacular than the civilization centered on a city in what is now southern Illinois. Cahokia. You need to understand what Cahokia was, not what it is today, a partially excavated archaeological site on the outskirts of St. Louis, most of it buried under a suburban landscape of strip malls and subdivisions. What it actually was, at its height, around 1100 CE. Cahokia was the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. At its peak, it housed a population estimated at between 10,000 and 20,000 people within the city itself, with a regional population of perhaps 100,000 in the surrounding settlements. The urban core covered an area of roughly 14 square kilometers. It was organized around a central plaza, the Grand Plaza, roughly the size of 40 football fields, surrounded by massive earthen mounds. The largest mound, Monk's Mound, is still standing. It is 30 meters tall. Its base covers more area than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built in stages over several centuries, the result of millions of basket loads of carefully selected earth carried by hand to construct a platform for the paramount chief's residence and ceremonial center. From the top of Monk's Mound, on a clear day, you could see for 30 miles in every direction. You would have seen a city, a planned city laid out with geometric precision, oriented to the cardinal directions and to specific solar and astronomical events. Near the Grand Plaza, archaeologists found what they called woodhenge, a series of large wooden posts arranged in circular patterns. Analysis of their alignment shows that they functioned as a sophisticated calendar, marking the solstices, equinoxes, and other significant solar events with precision. The people who built Cahokia were astronomers. They organized their city around their astronomical knowledge. The rising sun on the summer solstice aligned with specific mounds and with specific sightlines built into the urban plan. Sunrise on the spring equinox, one of the most important ceremonial moments in the Cahokian calendar, aligned perfectly with Monk's Mound and with the central axis of the Grand Plaza. This is not accidental. This is not superstition. This is applied astronomy, used to create a city that was simultaneously a settlement, a religious center, a political capital, and a precision instrument for marking time. Cahokia's influence spread far beyond its immediate region. The Mississippian culture, of which Cahokia was the greatest expression, shaped the societies of the entire eastern half of North America. Mississippian artifacts, Mississippian architectural styles, Mississippian ceramic traditions appear at sites from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic Coast to the Great Plains. The city, at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, was the gravitational center of a cultural world that encompassed millions of people. In what is now Canada, the influence of Mississippian culture was felt most strongly in the areas around Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. The peoples of the Neutral Nation and the Erie Confederacy, who lived along the northern shores of Lake Erie, were deeply embedded in continental trade networks that connected them southward to the Mississippian heartland. Pottery styles, ceremonial objects, and agricultural technologies moved northward along these networks, and northbound goods, particularly the copper and furs of the Canadian interior, moved southward. But Cahokia did not survive. Around 1200 CE, the population began to decline. By 1350, the great city had been largely abandoned. The reasons are debated. Deforestation from centuries of heavy wood use may have degraded the local environment. Climate change, specifically a cooling period that reduced agricultural productivity, may have shortened growing seasons and undermined the food surplus that supported the urban population. Political stress, the inevitable consequence of governing a large and complex hierarchical society through what appears to have been a theocratic system, may have generated internal conflict. Evidence of a massacre at one site near Cahokia, where over 200 individuals, many of them young women, were apparently sacrificed or killed in a single event, suggests that the political system could generate extraordinary violence when it was under pressure. Whatever the cause, Cahokia fell. The urban population dispersed. The great mounds were left to the encroaching forest, and a remarkable chapter in North American history ended. But the story of indigenous civilization north of Mexico was far from over. In fact, in many ways, the most intellectually and politically sophisticated developments were still to come. Let us go back to the north, to the land that would one day be called Canada. By the time Cahokia was declining, the peoples of what is now Ontario were in a period of profound transformation. Agricultural communities were growing larger and more complex. Villages were merging, through war and diplomacy, into larger political entities. New ceramic traditions were developing. Trade networks were expanding. And a distinctive cultural tradition, one that archaeologists call the Ontario Iroquoian tradition, was crystallizing into something that would eventually produce some of the most politically sophisticated societies on the continent. The Wendat Confederacy, also known historically as the Huron Confederacy, is among the most important political entities in the pre-contact history of what is now Canada. By the time European contact disrupted everything in the early 17th century, the Wendat were a confederacy of 4 or 5 nations: the Attignawantan, the Attineongnahak, the Arindaranon, the Tahontainrat, and possibly the Ataranchronan, living in a territory centered on the Georgian Bay region of what is now Ontario. The Wendat Confederacy was not as old as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but it was organized along similar lines and addressed similar problems. Its central governing council met at the largest Wendat community, and decisions required consensus among representatives of all the member nations. Its political culture was deeply influenced by Haudenosaunee precedent, which should not be surprising given that the two confederacies were in frequent contact and competition with each other. The Wendat homeland, the region they called Wendat, was a geographic unit of remarkable productivity. The land between Lake Simcoe, Georgian Bay, and what is now the southern edge of the Canadian Shield was rich in agricultural land, in freshwater fish, and in the resources of the boreal forest. The Wendat exploited all of these with sophisticated technology and careful management. Their villages moved every 10 to 20 years, when the surrounding agricultural land was exhausted and the nearby forest had been depleted for firewood and construction material. This was not the improvidence it might appear to modern eyes. It was an adaptive strategy that gave depleted landscapes time to recover while maintaining the agricultural productivity that the population required. At peak occupation, the Wendat homeland supported a population of between 20 and 30,000 people. In terms of population density, this was among the highest in pre-contact North America, north of Mexico. The largest Wendat villages, places like Cahokia and Ososane and Tinaostaye, each house several thousand people in dozens of longhouses surrounded by agricultural fields that could extend for several kilometers in every direction. The social organization of these communities was the matrilineal clan system. Wendat society was organized into clans, each named for an animal, each tracing descent through the female line. Membership in a clan connected an individual to clan members across all of the Wendat nations, creating a web of kinship and obligation that transcended political boundaries. A Wendat traveling far from home could expect hospitality from any community that included members of their clan. Marriage within a clan was forbidden, which meant that every marriage alliance connected 2 different clans, distributing kinship ties throughout the entire confederacy. It was, in effect, a social networking system, a way of creating and maintaining connections across a geographically dispersed and politically complex society. The political economy of the Wendat Confederacy was sophisticated enough to sustain long-distance trade across the entire Great Lakes basin and beyond. Wendat traders traveled hundreds of kilometers to trade with Algonquin communities to the north, exchanging corn and nets and goods manufactured in the agricultural villages for furs, dried meat, dried fish, and access to the resources of the Canadian Shield. By the time Europeans arrived, the Wendat had a trade empire that extended from the Atlantic coast to the western Great Lakes. from the Ottawa Valley to the northern shores of Lakes Huron and Superior. North of the agricultural zone, in the forests and tundra of the Canadian Shield, the Canadian Subarctic, and the Arctic, other equally sophisticated cultures had developed their own remarkable adaptations to the environments they inhabited. The ancestors of the Anishinaabe peoples, including the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, inhabited the transition zone between the agricultural south and the boreal forest of the north. They were not farmers in the way that the Wendat were farmers. Their subsistence was based on a complex seasonal round, moving between different ecological zones at different times of year to exploit different resources. Sugar maple trees in spring for syrup and sugar, wild rice, manuman, the sacred food that the Ojibwe believe was given to them by the Creator, harvested in the extensive wild rice beds of the Great Lakes region in autumn. Fishing throughout the year in the extraordinarily productive lakes and rivers of the Shield. Hunting deer, moose, and beaver in the forest. Harvesting berries and roots in season. Wild rice deserves particular attention because it represents a form of food production that does not fit neatly into the category of agriculture or hunting and gathering. The wild rice beds of the Great Lakes and Canadian Shield were not simply harvested, they were managed. Anishinaabe communities carefully regulated access to specific rice beds, seeded new beds, and maintained the conditions that allowed wild rice to thrive. They had an intimate, multi-generational knowledge of the ecological requirements of the plant and the ways in which human activity could enhance or degrade its productivity. This is food production. It is horticulture in all but name, but it leaves fewer archaeological traces than field agriculture, which is one of the reasons it was often overlooked by the archaeologists and historians who decided how to classify and evaluate indigenous economic systems. Further north, in the boreal forest zone of what is now northern Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, the Cree were among the peoples who had developed adaptations to one of the most demanding environments on the continent. Cree territory was enormous, stretching from the eastern shores of James Bay west to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in what is now Alberta, and from the tree line in the north to the agricultural zone in the south. The Cree were not a single nation, but a collection of related communities, speaking dialects of the Cree language, sharing cultural practices, and connected by the kinship networks and trade relationships that linked communities across vast distances. Cree survival in the boreal forest required a level of ecological knowledge and technical sophistication that deserves to be called science. Understanding where caribou would be at any given point in the year required knowledge of dozens of variables, snow conditions, wind patterns, browse availability, predator pressure, migration triggers that had to be synthesized and interpreted in real time. Making that understanding transmissible to the next generation required an educational system, whether or not it looked like the educational systems Europeans were familiar with. It required systematic observation and record keeping in the mind rather than on paper. And it required the wisdom to know when the patterns had changed and when inherited knowledge needed to be revised. In the Arctic, the ancestors of the Inuit had been living in one of the most extreme environments on Earth for thousands of years. The Thula culture, which expanded eastward from Alaska, beginning around 1000 CE, carrying with them a remarkable suite of technologies, kayaks and umiaks, harpoons with toggling heads, dog sleds, snow houses, replaced the earlier Dorset culture and established the cultural foundations of what would become Inuit civilization across the Canadian Arctic. The technological achievements of the Thule and their Inuit descendants are genuinely extraordinary. The kayak is arguably the most sophisticated small watercraft ever designed. It was engineered through centuries of iteration and refinement, to specific environmental conditions, to specific bodies of water, to specific hunting targets. There is not one kayak design, but dozens, each precisely adapted to the environment and purposes of the people who built it. The umiak, a larger open skin boat, could carry an entire family and their belongings across open Arctic water, and was used for hunting the bowhead whale, an animal that could weigh 60,000 kilograms, an animal that even today requires significant technology and skill to hunt successfully. The snow house, the igloo, is another piece of engineering genius that deserves more recognition than it typically receives. An igloo constructed properly is a thermally efficient shelter capable of maintaining interior temperatures tens of degrees above the outside air temperature, heated only by body heat and a small oil lamp. The design exploits the principles of thermal mass, insulation, and convection in ways that a trained architect would recognize as elegant, and it can be built in an hour or two from materials that exist everywhere in the environment it is designed for. The peoples of the Pacific Coast, the nations of what is now British Columbia and the southern Yukon, developed perhaps the most spectacular material culture of any indigenous civilization north of Mexico. The Pacific Northwest coast was, in ecological terms, extraordinarily generous. The rivers ran thick with salmon, millions of fish returning from the ocean each year to spawn. The tidal zone was rich in shellfish and marine mammals. The temperate rainforest provided cedar in abundance, a wood so versatile and so workable that entire civilizations were built from it. The Haida, the Tsimshian, the Heiltsuk, the Kwakwaka'waku, the Nusha Nulth, the Nlakapamuks, the Coast Salish, and the many other nations of the Pacific Coast developed a culture of remarkable artistic and ceremonial sophistication. The totem pole, perhaps the most recognizable indigenous art form, was one expression of this. Totem poles were not idol worship, as some early European observers insisted on calling them. They were heraldic monuments, genealogical documents carved in cedar, recording the lineage, the supernatural encounters, the property rights, and the political status of the families that raised them. They were public statements, legible to anyone who knew how to read the visual language of Northwest Coast art, about who a family was, where they came from, and what rights and privileges they could claim. The potlatch, the ceremonial feast and gift-giving ceremony that is one of the central institutions of Northwest Coast cultures, was not profligacy or wastefulness, as it was characterized by the Canadian government when it made the potlatch illegal in 1885, a prohibition that remained in force until 1951. The potlatch was a sophisticated, redistributive economic institution. It moved wealth from those who had accumulated it to those who had less, creating social bonds in the process. It validated political status through the demonstration of generosity rather than the hoarding of resources. It was a mechanism for maintaining social cohesion, for resolving disputes, for marking significant life events, and for preserving the oral historical record in a context of ceremony and memory. The illegalization of the potlatch was a direct assault on the economic, social, and cultural foundations of Northwest Coast Indigenous societies. Canadian colonial authorities understood quite clearly that as long as the potlatch existed, the social fabric of these communities would remain intact. And an intact social fabric meant communities capable of resisting dispossession and assimilation. Outlawing the potlatch was not about protecting Indigenous people from their own cultural practices, as the paternalistic language of the legislation implied. It was about destroying the institutional foundations of societies the Canadian government wanted to dismantle. But we are getting ahead of our story. Let us return to the broader sweep of pre-contact civilization, because the full picture of what existed before Canada has barely been sketched yet. One of the most persistent myths about pre-contact North America is that the continent was sparsely populated, that a few 100,000 or perhaps a few million people lived on a landmass of more than 20 million square kilometers, hardly making a dent in the wilderness around them. This myth was not an innocent mistake. It was politically motivated, and it served a very specific purpose. If you can convince yourself and others that the land was essentially empty, that it lacked the population density that Europeans associated with civilization, then you can argue that no one was meaningfully displaced when settlers moved in. Modern demographic research has completely demolished this myth. The best current scholarly estimates, based on settlement patterns in the archaeological record, on historical accounts from early contact, on the reconstruction of pre-epidemic population levels from genealogical and genetic evidence, put the pre-contact population of the Americas at between 40 million and 100 million people. The range is wide because the uncertainty is real. But even the most conservative estimate places the Americas among the most densely populated regions of the world in 1491. For what is now Canada specifically, estimates vary from around 2 million to over 3 million people at contact. Some researchers, using different methodologies and different assumptions about how badly the epidemic diseases that preceded formal European contact had already reduced populations, push the number higher. The absolute upper bound of serious scholarly estimates for the pre-contact population of Canada is around 7 million. 7 million people, in a land that the founding mythology of Canada described as wilderness, as empty, as terra nullius, or land belonging to no one. 7 million people who had sophisticated governance, sophisticated agriculture, sophisticated trade, sophisticated architecture, sophisticated art, sophisticated astronomy, and sophisticated philosophy. Not wilderness, a civilization. The trade networks that connected these millions of people deserve more attention than they usually receive, because they are one of the clearest demonstrations of the scale and sophistication of pre-contact Indigenous civilization. The copper trade is a good place to start. Lake Superior's southern shore contains the largest deposits of pure, native copper anywhere in the world. Indigenous peoples had been mining and trading this copper for at least 7,000 years before European contact. 7,000 years. The oldest continuous industrial operation in the history of the Americas. Copper from Lake Superior has been found at archaeological sites from the Gulf of Mexico to New England, from the Great Plains to the Atlantic coast. Thousands of kilometers from its source, shaped into tools, ornaments, and ceremonial objects by skilled craftspeople who understood its properties intimately. In the Great Lakes region, the copper trade was the foundation of an economic network that connected communities across what is now Ontario, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and beyond. The peoples of the Sault Ste. Marie area, the narrows between Lakes Huron and Superior where the St. Mary's River runs, were ideally positioned to control the flow of copper and other goods through this bottleneck of the Great Lakes trade system. The Anishinaabe who lived there and whose oral tradition records generations of presence at that specific location were not simply inhabitants of a piece of land. They were the operators of a critical node in a continental trade network. Obsidian from Yellowstone, pipestone, the red catlinite used for ceremonial pipe bowls, from quarries in what is now Minnesota that were treated as neutral ground, even by warring nations, sacred places where all peoples had the right to quarry the stone that connected them to the spirit world. Shells from both the Atlantic and the Pacific coasts, traded inland along routes that crossed the continent. Turquoise from the southwest, mica from the Appalachians. Tobacco, first cultivated in the tropics, traded northward through networks that eventually brought it to communities far north of its growing range. These goods moved along routes that were old when European explorers first traveled them. The paths that French and English explorers followed into the interior of the continent, the routes that eventually became fur trade highways and then Canadian roads and railroads and highways, were indigenous trade routes. Every major route of European penetration into the Canadian interior followed paths that indigenous peoples had established, maintained, and used for centuries. The explorers did not discover these routes. They were guided to them, told about them, and in most cases led along them by indigenous peoples who had known them for generations. The knowledge system that made this trade possible was equally sophisticated. Navigation on the Great Lakes without charts, without magnetic compasses, without satellite positioning, required an intimate knowledge of the lakes themselves, of weather patterns, of current, of the behavior of water in different conditions, of the shape of coastlines, and the location of landmarks. The birch bark canoe, the vessel in which this navigation was performed, is another piece of engineering genius. Light enough to be carried over long portages, strong enough to withstand open water on lakes that can generate waves several meters high, flexible enough to absorb shocks that would destroy a more rigid hull, designed to be repaired from materials available in the environment it traveled through. The birch bark canoe is not a primitive craft. It is a precision tool, the product of generations of refinement, by people who needed it to perform reliably in demanding conditions. When the French arrived in the St. Lawrence Valley in the early 16th century, they were entering a world that had been organized, inhabited, and managed for thousands of years. Jacques Cartier, on his second voyage in 1535, found not the empty wilderness that Canada's founding mythology would later describe, but a populated landscape. When he entered the St. Lawrence River, he encountered communities of people, Iroquoian-speaking people living in fortified towns, cultivating agricultural fields, fishing the river, and participating in trade networks that extended far beyond anything Cartier could see or imagine. At the site of what is now Quebec City, Cartier found a large Iroquoian town called Stadacona. Further upstream, at the foot of what is now Montreal, he found an even larger town called Hochelaga. Hochelaga had a population in the thousands. It was surrounded by a palisade, laid out in a planned grid, and organized around a central plaza from which 50 or more longhouses radiated outward. Cartier climbed the hill above Hochelaga, the hill he named Mont Royal, and which gave Montreal its name, and described looking out over a landscape of cultivated fields, forests, and winding rivers that stretched as far as he could see in every direction. By the time Samuel de Champlain arrived in the same region 70 years later, both Stadacona and Hochelaga had vanished. Their populations were gone. The towns were not there. This disappearance has puzzled historians for centuries and generated considerable controversy about what happened in the street. Lawrence Valley, between Cartier's visits and Champlain's. The most likely explanation involves a combination of factors. The people Cartier encountered were probably early casualties of the epidemic diseases that traveled ahead of European contact. Measles, smallpox, and other Old World diseases to which indigenous peoples had no prior immunity may have arrived in the St. Lawrence Valley before any European explorer did, carried along the very trade networks that made pre-contact civilization possible. A disease that arrived in the Caribbean with Columbus in 1492 could, traveling along well-established indigenous trade routes, have reached the St. Lawrence Valley within decades. The epidemics that preceded formal European contact in many parts of North America were catastrophic beyond easy comprehension. In some regions, population losses of 70 to 90% within the first century of contact have been documented or estimated. 90%, 9 out of 10 people dead, not in warfare, not through displacement, but through diseases introduced by a civilization that did not know the danger it was carrying, and that later, in some documented cases, knew quite well and did not care. The scale of this demographic catastrophe reshaped everything. It reshaped political structures that depended on specific populations. It reshaped the leadership of communities that lost their most experienced elders and their institutional memory in a few terrible seasons. It reshaped the ecological landscape because when the people who managed that landscape died, the management stopped and the forest grew back over the fields and the game returned to the villages, and European explorers arriving a generation later saw what appeared to them to be pristine wilderness. It was not wilderness, it was the aftermath of a civilizational collapse. Charles Mann, in his landmark book, 1491, described the Americas that Columbus encountered, not as a pristine wilderness, but as a managed landscape, largely depopulated by epidemic disease in the century between Columbus's first voyage and the period when sustained European colonization began. The forest that William Bradford described as howling wilderness when the Pilgrim Fathers arrived in Massachusetts in 1620 had been cleared farmland just a century before. The trees that grew there were second growth, colonizing abandoned fields. The silence that European settlers interpreted as evidence of emptiness was the silence of a people 90% dead. In Canada, the epidemics arrived in different regions at different times, often outrunning direct European contact by years or decades. The Wendat confederacy, which had a population of perhaps 20 to 30,000 at the time of contact with French missionaries in the 1620s, was devastated by epidemics in the late 1630s that killed roughly half the population in a few years. The social, political, and military consequences of this catastrophic population loss contributed directly to the destruction of the Wendat confederacy in the wars of 1648 to 1650. Those wars were themselves shaped by the dynamics of European contact. The French, who had established an alliance with the Wendat, supplied their allies with iron tools and eventually with firearms. The Haudenosaunee, who had allied themselves with the Dutch and later the English, also acquired firearms. The resulting conflict was not simply a continuation of pre-contact warfare. It was warfare transformed in its scale and lethality by the introduction of new technologies and by the economic pressures of the fur trade, which gave communities powerful incentives to control or eliminate competitors in the competition for furs to trade to European powers. The dispersal of the Wendat Confederacy in 1649 and 1650 was one of the most significant political events in the pre-Confederation history of what is now Canada. The Wendat were not annihilated. Thousands survived and dispersed in different directions. Some were adopted into Haudenosaunee communities. Some fled west to the Great Lakes region and eventually to what is now Michigan and Wisconsin. Some were absorbed into French colonial society. Some reestablished themselves north of the St. Lawrence. But the Wendat Confederacy as a political entity was shattered. The dense agricultural settlements of Georgian Bay were abandoned. The longhouses and palisades were burned. The agricultural fields were left to revert to forest. And 60 years later, European settlers moving into the area found a landscape that appeared to them to have never been inhabited by anything more complex than small bands of hunters. This is how erasure works. It does not always require someone to pick up a pen and deliberately falsify the record, although that happened too. It requires only the deaths of millions of people, the abandonment of their towns and fields, the growth of forest over the evidence of their habitation, and then the arrival of people who have no framework for understanding what they are looking at and no motivation to look carefully. But the physical evidence did not disappear entirely. It could not. The mounds remained, the earthworks remained, the agricultural ridges, the raised beds of carefully cultivated soil remained under the regrowth. The ossuaries, the communal burial pits where Wendat communities reinterred their dead in great feast of the dead ceremonies, remained in the ground. The artifact assemblages remained in the soil at village sites, pottery and stone tools and copper objects waiting to be found by people who were willing to understand what they meant. Archaeology in Canada began in earnest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Its findings, when honestly interpreted, tell an unambiguous story about the depth and complexity of pre-contact Indigenous civilization. But the interpretation was not always honest. The field was shaped by the cultural assumptions of its practitioners, who were trained in a tradition that categorized societies by their stage of development on an evolutionary scale, with European civilization at the top and Indigenous peoples of North America occupying various rungs below. This evolutionary framework distorted archaeological interpretation in systematic ways. Sites that showed signs of complexity were often attributed to influence from more southerly, more agriculturally intensive, more European-like cultures, rather than being understood as indigenous developments. Evidence of long-distance trade was sometimes interpreted as occasional adventurism rather than as the operation of established commercial networks. Evidence of social hierarchy was sometimes used to suggest that pre-contact societies were not as egalitarian as their living descendants claimed, in a selective application of archaeological evidence designed to undermine the political claims of Indigenous peoples in land disputes and treaty negotiations. This is not ancient history, it is recent. The distortion of the archaeological record to serve colonial political purposes was a practice of the 20th century, not just the 19th, and its effects are still visible in how Canadian history is taught, how pre-contact civilization is presented in museums and textbooks, and how the political claims of Indigenous peoples are understood or misunderstood by the Canadian public. The Iroquoian village sites of southern Ontario provide a clear example. For decades, the standard archaeological narrative described these sites as evidence of small, mobile communities that moved frequently and left few lasting marks on the landscape. This narrative served the purpose of making the land appear lightly used and easily available. But when archaeologists began applying more rigorous methods of landscape analysis, including aerial photography, ground-penetrating radar, and systematic sampling over large areas, a different picture emerged. Sites that had been interpreted as small, temporary encampments turned out to be the remnants of large, planned villages occupied for decades. Agricultural field systems that extended for kilometers around the villages appeared in the patterning of soil, chemistry, and buried microbotanical evidence. The landscape of southern Ontario was not lightly used. It was intensively managed. The communities that lived there were not small bands of wandering hunters. They were communities of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of people who had built permanent infrastructure, managed agricultural landscapes, and maintained complex political and social institutions. The Mantle site in York Region, Ontario, excavated between 2003 and 2005, provides a striking example. The site was a large Wendat village, occupied in the late 16th century, shortly before the epidemics that would devastate the Confederacy. The village was home to an estimated 1,700 people, housed in dozens of longhouses behind a triple palisade. The settlement covered about 2.5 hectares of an original area of over 3 hectares, with agricultural fields and associated activity areas extending well beyond the palisade. It was a town by any reasonable definition of the term, and its existence in what later became the suburban periphery of Toronto speaks directly to the density of pre-contact Indigenous habitation in that landscape. Further east, the archaeology of the St. Lawrence Valley continues to reveal the depth of the Iroquoian presence that Cartier encountered and Champlain found gone. Recent work at sites around Quebec City and in the upper St. Lawrence Valley has pushed back the dates of Iroquoian agriculture in the region and has shown that the people Cartier encountered in 1534 and 1535 were the inheritors of an agricultural tradition that had been developing in the St. Lawrence lowlands for centuries. In the western Great Lakes region and the prairies of what is now Manitoba and Saskatchewan, the archaeology of pre-contact Indigenous civilization is less well known but equally rich. The Selkirk culture, the Black Duck culture, and the various late woodland traditions of the Canadian interior represent sophisticated adaptations to the mixed forest and grassland environments of the continental interior. The earthwork complexes of the Red River Valley in what is now Manitoba, including the Bercé ceremonial site and the various medicine wheel sites of the northern plains, speak to the ceremonial and cosmological sophistication of the peoples who built them. The medicine wheels of the Great Plains are one of the most interesting and least understood aspects of pre-contact Indigenous civilization in Canada. A medicine wheel is a circular arrangement of stones, typically with a central cairn, and radiating spokes of stone extending outward like the spokes of a wheel. Dozens of medicine wheels have been documented in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, as well as in the American states immediately to the south. Some are small, some are enormous, with diameters of 90 meters or more. Some have spokes that align with specific astronomical events, the rising of particular stars, or the direction of sunrise on solstices and equinoxes. The Majorville cairn in Alberta has been dated to at least 5,000 years old, making it one of the oldest astronomical monuments in the Americas. 5,000 years. That is roughly contemporary with Stonehenge, the construction of the Great Pyramids of Giza, and the earliest stages of the Bronze Age in Europe. While European civilization was in its earliest phases of organized monument building, the peoples of the Alberta Plains were constructing precisely aligned astronomical observatories from stone. This is not a coincidence or a fluke. It is evidence of the kind of sustained astronomical observation and accumulated knowledge that requires stable communities, long-term record keeping, and a social structure capable of organizing collective labor over long periods of time. Nomadic people can be astronomers, but building a monument of this size and precision requires generations of accumulated knowledge about the movements of the sky, organizational capacity to coordinate the construction effort, and sufficient cultural continuity to maintain the tradition of building and using the monument across the centuries. The peoples of the Alberta Plains had all of these things. The Blackfoot Confederacy, which occupied the Alberta Plains at the time of European contact and whose members maintain a living connection to the medicine wheel traditions, had a culture of extraordinary depth and complexity. Their cosmological system, their ceremonial life, their system of governance, and their ecological knowledge of the plains environment were the products of centuries of development and refinement. They were not simple nomads. They were specialists in the management of one of the most productive and demanding environments on the continent. The buffalo hunt, in particular, was a feat of ecological management and social organization that deserves recognition as one of the great technological achievements of pre-contact North America. The communal buffalo hunt, using pounds and jumps, driving herds over cliffs or into constructed enclosures, required the coordinated effort of hundreds of people, careful knowledge of animal behavior, understanding of landscape and wind, sophisticated signaling systems, and precisely timed execution. Head smashed in. Buffalo Jump in Alberta, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was used continuously for nearly 6,000 years. 6,000 years of coordinated hunting at a single site, maintaining a tradition of knowledge and practice across dozens of generations. In the far north, the Dean peoples of what is now the Northwest Territories and northern Alberta and Saskatchewan, and the Inuit of the Arctic coast maintain sophisticated civilizations adapted to environments that no other human culture on Earth had learned to inhabit year-round. The Dean, speakers of related languages in the Athabascan family, had developed extraordinary expertise in tracking and hunting woodland caribou, in navigating the boreal forest in all seasons, and in maintaining far-flung social networks across vast territories. Their world was large in ways that the geographically bounded civilizations of the South were not. A Dani individual might, over the course of a lifetime, travel through territories encompassing hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. The Inuit culture of the Arctic is the latest large-scale prehistoric cultural development in North America, with the Thule culture arriving in the Canadian Arctic from Alaska around 1000 CE and expanding eastward until it covered the entire Arctic coastline from Alaska to Greenland. The sophistication of Thule and Inuit technology has been described in this documentary already, but it bears emphasis. These were not people surviving at the edge of human possibility through sheer endurance. They were thriving in an environment of incredible challenge through the application of sophisticated technology, accumulated ecological knowledge, and social systems precisely calibrated to the demands of Arctic life. The snow house, the dog sled, the kayak, the toggling harpoon head, the seal oil lamp, the caribou skin clothing system with its multiple insulating layers, the knowledge of sea ice conditions that distinguish safe from dangerous travel surfaces, the ability to navigate by stars, by wind, by the behavior of animals, and by subtle variations in snow texture. These technologies, individually impressive, together constitute a technological system of extraordinary sophistication, capable of sustaining human life in conditions that would kill an unprepared person from any other culture within days. By the time European contact began in earnest in the 16th century, the peoples of what is now Canada represented tens of thousands of years of human civilization. Not the accidental accumulation of subsistence strategies, but the deliberate, cumulative, intergenerational development of knowledge, technology, governance, art, philosophy, and ecological management. A civilization of depth and complexity comparable in every dimension that matters to the civilizations that European explorers and settlers brought with them from the other side of the ocean. And then came the process of erasure. The erasure of pre-contact Indigenous civilization from Canadian history and Canadian consciousness was not a single event. It was a process sustained over centuries, operating through multiple mechanisms, some deliberate and some structural, that progressively stripped away the markers of complexity and sophistication that would have made it impossible to justify what was happening. The first mechanism was disease. This has been discussed. The epidemics that preceded and accompanied European contact killed enormous numbers of people. They killed the people who held the most knowledge, elders who carried the historical memory of communities in their minds, leaders who understood the political relationships between nations, specialists whose knowledge of specific ecological niches or technical processes had been accumulated over a lifetime. When these people died, their knowledge died with them. The oral library was destroyed. The second mechanism was physical displacement. As European settlements expanded, Indigenous communities were pushed off the land they had inhabited, managed, and understood for generations. Displacement meant separation from the specific landscapes that Indigenous knowledge systems were built around. A Wendat farmer's knowledge of the agricultural potential of a specific valley in Georgian Bay was useless when she was forced to live 200 kilometers away. In land she did not know. A Cree hunter's intimate familiarity with a specific section of boreal forest was lost when the forest was logged and the animals were gone. The third mechanism was the deliberate destruction of Indigenous cultural and educational institutions. The residential school system, which operated in Canada from the 1880s until the 1990s, was explicitly designed to sever the transmission of culture and knowledge between generations. Children were taken from their families, prohibited from speaking their languages, punished for practicing their cultural traditions, and subjected to a regime designed to replace their Indigenous identity with a Europeanized one. The system was not, as its architects sometimes claimed, simply an attempt to assimilate Indigenous people into Canadian society for their own benefit. It was a program of cultural genocide designed to destroy the institutions and the knowledge systems that gave Indigenous communities their coherence, their resilience, and their capacity to resist dispossession. The fourth mechanism was legal prohibition. The potlatch ban has been mentioned. The sun dance, one of the central ceremonial institutions of the Plains peoples, was similarly banned. The practice of Indigenous religion and ceremony was suppressed. The transmission of oral tradition, which happened in ceremonial contexts, was therefore suppressed. The languages that carried cultural knowledge, that encoded in their very grammar and vocabulary understandings of the world that had no equivalent in English or French, were attacked. The legal framework of the Indian Act, first passed in 1876, treated Indigenous peoples as legal minors, incapable of governing themselves, their lands, their resources, or their cultural expressions. The fifth mechanism was historiographic. It operated in the academy, in the school systems, in the museums, in the popular media. It systematically presented Indigenous peoples as primitives, as people without history, as people whose past was irrelevant to the history of Canada, which began in the standard telling with European contact. The disciplines of archaeology, anthropology, and history were shaped by colonial assumptions that made it difficult to see what was actually in the record. Evidence of complexity was explained away. Evidence of sophisticated governance was described as folklore. The oral traditions that preserved thousands of years of historical memory were classified as myth rather than as historical sources. The sixth mechanism was religious. Christian missionaries understood, often explicitly, that the conversion of Indigenous peoples to Christianity required the destruction of Indigenous spiritual practices, because those practices were the ceremonial context in which cultural knowledge was transmitted and maintained. The missionary project was therefore not simply about saving souls. It was about dismantling the institutional foundations of Indigenous civilizations. Some missionaries were genuinely compassionate people who believed they were helping. Many were not, and regardless of individual intentions, the systematic suppression of Indigenous religious practices that the missionary enterprise produced was catastrophic for the transmission of cultural knowledge. But here is what the erasure could not accomplish. It could not erase the land itself. The earthworks are still there, under the soil of southern Ontario and Manitoba and Alberta. The medicine wheels are still on the plains. The maiden heaps of the Pacific Coast communities contain thousands of years of accumulating evidence of the lives of the people who created them. The oral traditions, suppressed and damaged, but never fully destroyed, still carry their knowledge in the memories of communities that refuse to disappear. The languages, most of them severely endangered, some of them now in active revitalization, still encode their irreplaceable ways of knowing. And increasingly, the archaeology is telling a story that can no longer be easily dismissed. Ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR aerial imaging are revealing the outlines of buried villages, the patterning of ancient agricultural fields, the hidden structures of earthwork complexes that were invisible to the naked eye. Ancient DNA analysis is providing new understandings of population movement, of kinship, of the demographic history of pre-contact communities. Isotopic analysis of food residues in pottery is revealing the diets and agricultural practices of people who lived centuries before anyone thought to write about them in a language Europeans could read. At the Draper site in York Region, Ontario, excavations over decades revealed the remains of a very large Iroquoian village occupied in the 15th century. The village grew over time, incorporating refugee populations from other communities, expanding its palisade and adding longhouses in a way that is archaeologically visible as an adaptive response to increasing population pressure. This is not primitive subsistence. This is urban planning, responsive governance, and demographic management in a pre-contact Indigenous community. At the Nodwell site on Georgian Bay, a large Wendat village occupied around 1600, archaeologists found evidence of longhouses arranged in a regular pattern around open communal spaces, with what appears to be a planned spatial organization of the settlement. The village had been occupied and expanded over generations, with earlier structures visible beneath later ones in a stratigraphy that speaks to the stability and continuity of the community. Along the entire Pacific coast, the massive middens, some of them 4 to 5 meters deep and covering areas of several hectares that mark the locations of ancient villages, are archives of ecological history. Their layers record not just what people ate, but how the environment changed over time, how fish populations fluctuated, how sea levels shifted, how the climate varied. They are, in a very real sense, climate and ecological records preserved by the unintentional archaeology of daily life. And they show, in site after site, continuous occupation stretching back hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. The Namu site on the central coast of British Columbia has been occupied, according to the archaeological evidence, for at least 10,000 years. 10,000 years of continuous human habitation at a single location. There are few places in the world where the archaeological record of human occupation is so deep and so unbroken. The people who live near Namu today, the Heiltsuk Nation, have oral traditions that speak of ancient connections to this coastline. The archaeology confirms what the oral tradition claims. This is the pattern. The oral traditions say one thing. The archaeology confirms it. The colonial historiography said something different. And slowly, painfully, the historical record is being corrected. The question of how the Haudenosaunee Confederacy influenced the United States Constitution has been debated in American academic and political circles for decades, and similar questions about the influence of Indigenous political thought on Canadian political development have received less attention. But they deserve attention. The French administrators who dealt with Indigenous nations in New France were not dealing with simple tribal people. They were dealing with sophisticated political actors who understood diplomacy, who used ceremony and symbol with precision, who knew how to negotiate from positions of both strength and vulnerability, and whose political structures were in some respects more stable and more representative than the monarchical and mercantilist structures of the French Empire. The fur trade alliance between the French and the Wendat, and later the alliance with the Anishinaabe nations after the dispersal of the Wendat, was not a simple commercial relationship. It was a diplomatic arrangement governed by protocols and ceremonies that the French had to learn and respect, or lose access to the resources they needed. The annual gift-giving ceremonies that cemented these alliances were not a French imposition of their ideas about diplomacy on Indigenous peoples. They were indigenous diplomatic protocols that the French adapted themselves to because they had to. The entire French colonial enterprise in North America depended in its early centuries on indigenous hospitality, indigenous knowledge, indigenous labor, and indigenous political goodwill. Without the Wendat and their agricultural surplus, the French colonies would have starved. Without indigenous guides, the French could not have navigated the interior of the continent. Without indigenous military alliances, the French would have been unable to survive the military competition with the English. The French knew this. The most perceptive French administrators said so explicitly. And yet the history that emerged from the colonial period systematically minimized the role of indigenous peoples in the survival and development of French Canada. The British, who took formal control of New France in 1763, had their own complicated history of indigenous alliance and dispossession. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, which reserved the lands west of the Appalachians for indigenous peoples and required that their lands could only be purchased by the crown rather than by individual settlers, was a legal acknowledgement that indigenous peoples had rights in their lands that had to be respected. It was also, in practice, one of the most violated pieces of legislation in Canadian legal history. The Indian Act of 1876 consolidated and extended the colonial relationship between the Canadian state and indigenous peoples into a comprehensive legal system of control and dispossession. Under the Indian Act, indigenous peoples living on reserves were classified as wards of the state, without the legal rights of full citizens. They could not vote. They could not hold the same legal property rights as other Canadians. They could not leave the reserve without permission. They could not practice their traditional ceremonies. Their children could be taken from them and sent to residential schools. Their traditional governance structures were replaced by elected band councils, whose decisions could be overridden by the federal Indian agent who lived on or near every reserve. The residential school system deserves more than passing mention in any honest history of Canada, because it was one of the primary mechanisms through which the erasure of pre-contact civilization was perpetuated across generations. The schools, run by various Christian denominations under federal contract, operated on the explicit principle that the children placed in them needed to be separated from their cultural heritage. The famous phrase, attributed to Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of the first American residential school, but echoed by Canadian administrators, was that the schools needed to kill the Indian in the child. Canadian children from First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities were taken, sometimes willingly, by families who were led to believe their children would receive a good education, often by coercion, from the 1880s onward. They were given European names. They were punished, often severely, for speaking their languages. They were taught that their cultures, their religions, their families, and their communities were inferior. They were taught that indigenous peoples had no history worth knowing, no civilization worth preserving, no wisdom worth transmitting. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which documented the history and legacy of the residential school system in its final reports published in 2015, heard testimony from thousands of survivors. It documented deaths at residential schools numbering in the thousands through disease, neglect, and in some cases violence. It documented the long-term psychological and social consequences of the system on individuals, families, and communities. And it described what happened in those schools as cultural genocide. Cultural genocide. Not metaphorically, the TRC used that phrase deliberately, defining it as the destruction of those structures and practices that allow the group to continue as a group. The residential school system was designed to destroy Indigenous culture as a functioning, transmissible system of knowledge and identity. It largely failed in that ultimate goal because Indigenous peoples were more resilient than the architects of the system anticipated. But the damage it did was real, severe, and ongoing. The effects of intergenerational trauma, of language loss, of disconnection from cultural knowledge are still being worked through by Indigenous communities across Canada today. Alongside the residential school system, the legal suppression of Indigenous political institutions continued through the 19th and 20th centuries. The Indian Act's provisions against traditional governance were not simply bureaucratic intrusions. They were direct attacks on the political philosophies and structures that had governed Indigenous communities for centuries. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which had operated under the Great Law of Peace for centuries, and which had been a sovereign political entity that had negotiated treaties with European powers on equal terms, found its political authority unilaterally stripped away by Canadian legislation that refused to recognize its legitimacy. This legal erasure had practical consequences that are still being contested in Canadian courts today. Land claims, treaty rights, resource rights, self-governance rights, the rights of Indigenous peoples to determine the future of their own communities. All of these exist in a legal landscape shaped by a century and a half of Canadian legislation that treated Indigenous peoples as obstacles to be managed rather than as nations with inherent rights. But the land remembers what Canadian law tried to forget. Archaeological work is accelerating, and Indigenous communities are increasingly directing the study of their own histories. The partnership between archaeologists and Indigenous knowledge keepers that has developed in Canada over the past 3 decades is producing research that is both more accurate and more ethically grounded than the colonial archaeology that preceded it. Indigenous communities are not simply research subjects or stakeholders to be consulted. They are intellectual partners whose oral traditions, whose ceremonial knowledge, and whose living connections to specific landscapes provide essential context for the physical evidence in the ground. The work at the Squamish Nation's Atalka Shem territory in what is now Howe Sound is an example. Archaeological research in partnership with Squamish Nation representatives has revealed evidence of continuous human habitation in that area going back 9,000 years or more. The Squamish oral tradition, which speaks of ancient connections to specific mountains, glaciers, and bodies of water in that landscape, is now being understood not as myth, but as deep historical memory, a record of human experience in a specific place across thousands of years. Similar work is being done across the country. In Nunavut, in the Northwest Territories, in British Columbia, in Ontario, in Quebec, in the Maritime Provinces, the collaboration between archaeologists and Indigenous communities is producing a picture of pre-contact civilization that is richer, more complex, and more politically significant than anything the colonial historiography allowed. The significance is not merely academic. The recognition that pre-contact Indigenous civilizations were sophisticated, complex, and deeply rooted in the specific landscapes of Canada has direct implications for how we understand the legal and political claims of Indigenous peoples today. If the land was not wilderness before European contact, if it was managed, governed, and inhabited by complex civilizations, then the legal fictions that justified its dispossession, terra nullius, the doctrine of discovery, the idea that sovereignty followed from effective occupation in the European sense, collapse. These legal fictions have been challenged in Canadian courts since the landmark Calder case in 1973, which established for the first time that Aboriginal title to land existed in Canadian law and had never been fully extinguished. The subsequent Delgamuukw decision in 1997 established that oral history had to be treated with equal weight to written historical records in establishing Aboriginal title. The Silcotin decision in 2014 granted the first declaration of Aboriginal title to a specific territory in Canadian legal history. Each of these cases depended, to varying degrees, on the historical record, on the demonstration that specific Indigenous communities had exercised continuous, exclusive, and effective occupation of specific territories, before European contact and since. The archaeological record, the oral traditions, and the documentary history of contact all contributed to that demonstration. The erasure was incomplete, and its incompleteness was legally and politically significant. But the deepest significance of the pre-contact history of Canada is not legal. It is not political. It is not even primarily historical. It is moral. We are talking about civilizations that endured for thousands of years. Civilizations that solved the fundamental problems of human social life, how to govern communities, how to resolve conflicts without destroying the community in the process, how to manage resources sustainably across generations, how to transmit knowledge reliably over time, how to maintain cultural continuity in the face of environmental change in ways that were effective and often brilliant. We are talking about civilizations that produced art of extraordinary beauty, political philosophy of remarkable sophistication, and ecological knowledge of incomparable depth. These civilizations were not swept away by some inevitable tide of history. They were deliberately targeted by policies and institutions designed to destroy them. The agents of that destruction knew what they were doing. Many of them said so explicitly. The residential school system's founders said so. The architects of the Indian Act said so. The government officials who outlawed the potlatch and the Sundance said so. They were not confused about what they were attacking. They were attacking organized civilizations with systems of knowledge, governance, and identity that made dispossession and replacement difficult. The erasure was not complete. It was never complete. The civilizations targeted for destruction had roots too deep, knowledge too embedded, and people too resilient for the erasure to be total. The languages are endangered, but many are still spoken, and vigorous revitalization efforts are underway across the country. The ceremonies are practiced. The oral traditions are being preserved and transmitted. The political structures are being reasserted. The land claims are moving through the courts. The archaeological record is being honestly interpreted. And there are the mounds, in what is now the Niagara Peninsula, in the river valleys of southwestern Ontario, in the areas around the north shore of Lake Erie. The burial mounds of Hopewell-influenced woodland cultures sit in fields and forests, often privately owned, often unmarked. Some have been excavated, most have not. Each one is an archive, a repository of objects and information about the lives of people who lived there 2,000 years ago. More, they are not myths. They are not the creations of a lost race of non-Indigenous people. They are the graves of the ancestors of living Indigenous communities, placed in a landscape their descendants still inhabit, in a country that for a century and a half tried its best to pretend they were never there. There is something both tragic and hopeful about the persistence of these markers. Tragic because they stand in a landscape that has so thoroughly obscured the civilization that created them. Hopeful because they stand at all, because they waited, because the land held them while the country built, over them tried to forget they were there. The story of the civilizations that existed in North America before Canada is not a story that belongs only to Indigenous peoples, although it is their story first and most intimately. It is a story that belongs to everyone who lives on this land, because the land is shaped by that history. The trade routes that became Canadian highways, the agricultural clearings that became Canadian towns, the diplomatic protocols that influenced, however unacknowledgedly, the development of Canadian political culture. The ecological knowledge that as Canada faces the profound challenges of climate change and resource management turns out to be more relevant than anyone in the mainstream discourse has been willing to admit. The deep history of this continent is not a footnote to Canadian history. It is its foundation. It is the story of what happened here for 10,000 years or more before the story that most Canadians know. It is a story of extraordinary human achievement, of civilizational flourishing, of political creativity, of ecological wisdom accumulated over generations beyond counting, and it was, in the most deliberate sense, erased. Not erased completely, not erased permanently. The archaeologists are finding it again. The oral traditions are carrying it forward. The communities that were targeted for destruction are reclaiming it. And increasingly, Canadians who did not grow up with this knowledge are encountering it in court decisions and museum exhibits, and truth and reconciliation processes, and in the simply available fact of the archaeological record, and are having to confront what it means for the story they were told about their country. Because here is the honest conclusion of this history. Canada did not emerge on an empty land. It was built on the ruins of civilizations that were not ruins when Canada arrived. They were living, functioning, sophisticated societies that were made into ruins. The great law of peace was still being practiced. The longhouses were still standing. The agricultural fields were still producing. The trade networks were still operating. The ceremonies were still being performed. The knowledge was still being transmitted. Canada was not built in a wilderness. Canada was built on top of a world that was destroyed to make room for it. That is a difficult thing to acknowledge. It is much more comfortable to believe the founding myth, the empty land, the howling wilderness, the adventurous settlers carving a nation out of nothing. It is a myth with a long pedigree, repeated in school textbooks, in political speeches, in the national story that Canadians tell themselves about who they are and where they came from. But it is a myth. The evidence that it is a myth is in the ground, in the oral traditions, in the genetic record, in the archaeological sites, in the court decisions, in the reports of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in the findings of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, in the ongoing presence and resistance and revival of the Indigenous civilizations that Canada tried to erase. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is still an active political entity, still governed in part by the Great Law of Peace, still asserting sovereignty over its traditional territory. The First Nations of British Columbia are still fighting in Canadian courts and on the land for recognition of their title to territories their ancestors managed for thousands of years. The Cree of northern Quebec have negotiated one of the most significant Indigenous self-governance agreements in Canadian history, the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, and its successors, asserting control over a territory they have inhabited for millennia. The Inuit of Nunavut govern their own territory, created in 1999, covering 2 million square kilometers of the eastern Arctic. The Métis, the people who emerged from the meeting of Indigenous and European peoples in the fur trade era, are asserting rights and recognition after centuries of legal ambiguity. The civilizations that were here before Canada are not dead. They were targeted for elimination, and they survived. The knowledge that was suppressed is being recovered and revitalized. The languages that were nearly destroyed are being taught to children who will teach them to their children. The ceremonies that were outlawed are being practiced. The land that was taken is being fought for, and in some cases returned. The story of what existed in North America before Canada is not a story about the past. It is a story about the present, about the ongoing relationship between a country and the civilizations it was built upon, about the question of what justice, what honesty, what genuine reconciliation requires. The mounds are still there. The medicine wheels are still on the plains. The stories are still being told. The land still remembers. And perhaps, if Canada is willing to listen, it might learn something from the 10,000 years of wisdom that were here before it arrived. Before Canada, there was a world of extraordinary depth, complexity, and achievement, a world that was deliberately obscured to make room for the story Canada wanted to tell about itself. That world cannot be fully recovered. Too much was lost. Too many people died. Too much knowledge was suppressed for too long. But enough remains in the ground, in the communities, in the oral traditions, in the ongoing political and legal assertions of Indigenous peoples, to give us a real, honest, and humbling picture of what this land was before it was Canada. That picture does not diminish Canada. It enlarges our understanding of what this place is and what it might yet become. It demands a reckoning with what was done, and it offers, in the depth and sophistication of the civilizations that were here, a measure of the extraordinary human capacity that has always existed in this land, that exists here still, and that Canadian society has yet to fully honor or understand. The land was never empty. It was never simply wilderness. It was a world, and that world deserves to be known. There is a specific story that deserves its own space in this documentary because it captures something essential about the gap between what pre-contact Indigenous civilization actually was and what colonial Canada insisted on believing about it. It is the story of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy's relationship with Wampum. Wampum is a word that has been so thoroughly distorted by its casual use in English that most people who use it today have no idea what it actually referred to. In popular usage, wampum means money, specifically primitive money, the beads that naive Indigenous people allegedly traded for Manhattan Island and other pieces of real estate they did not understand the significance of. This usage is wrong in almost every particular. Wampum was produced from the shells of the quahog, clam, and the whelk found along the Atlantic coast. The purple and white beads were laboriously drilled and shaped, then strung or woven into belts, sometimes of extraordinary complexity and beauty. The production of wampum was skilled labor. The belts could take months to make, and they were not money in the sense of a medium of exchange for everyday transactions. Wampum belts were constitutional documents. The Great Law of Peace was recorded in wampum. Each belt encoded specific provisions of the law in its patterns of purple and white beads. The Haudenosaunee had wampum keepers, specialists whose responsibility was to memorize the meaning of each belt and to read the Constitution aloud at the Grand Council, reciting the law by running their fingers over the beads, each pattern triggering the memorized text it recorded. The wampum belts were the Haudenosaunee equivalent of a written constitution, a binding legal code preserved in a medium that required trained readers to decode. Wampum belts were also used in diplomacy. The two-row wampum, the Gus Wen Ta, is the most famous example. Two parallel rows of purple wampum on a white background. The two purple rows represent two vessels traveling down the same river. One vessel is a birch bark canoe carrying the Haudenosaunee with their laws, their customs, and their ways of life. The other is a European ship carrying Europeans with their laws, their customs, and their ways of life. The vessels travel the same river side by side. Neither one steers the other. Neither one's passengers cross into the other vessel. They travel in peace and friendship, but separately, each under their own governance. This belt was presented to Dutch representatives in 1613. It was the Haudenosaunee articulation of their understanding of the relationship between their sovereignty and European sovereignty. It was a constitutional document in the Haudenosaunee legal system, and by the protocols of that system, it was binding. The treaty it represented was real, and its terms were clear. Canada doesn't honor those terms. It never fully did. The entire structure of Canadian law regarding Indigenous peoples presumes that Canadian sovereignty supersedes Indigenous sovereignty, that the colonial state's jurisdiction extends over Indigenous peoples and their lands without limitation. The two-row wampum says something completely different, and the fact that the Haudenosaunee have carried those belts, preserved them, and continue to cite them in diplomatic and legal contexts for 400 years says something important about the depth and durability of Indigenous legal thought. The wampum records are not unique to the Haudenosaunee. Across North America, Indigenous peoples developed sophisticated systems for preserving and transmitting historical, legal, and ceremonial knowledge in forms that were highly durable and deeply integrated into cultural practice. The winter counts of the Plains peoples, pictographic records of significant annual events painted on buffalo hides, are historical chronicles of a kind comparable to the annals kept by medieval European monks. They record droughts, battles, epidemics, celestial events, and political changes over spans of centuries, and the knowledge of how to read them was transmitted across generations. The birch bark scrolls of the Anishinaabe Midewiwin, the Grand Medicine Society, encoded ceremonial and medicinal knowledge in a writing system because birch bark scrolls are a form of writing that preserved information across generations outside the fallible human memory. The scrolls are not simple pictographs. They are sophisticated mnemonic documents that trigger, in trained readers, the recitation of specific knowledge encoded by specific symbols. They are a library. They are pre-contact Indigenous Canada's written record. The Kwakwaka'waku of British Columbia encoded genealogical, historical, and cosmological information in the carved poles, masks, and houseposts of their ceremonial and domestic architecture. The reading of this visual language required training, the same kind of training. Required to read hieroglyphics or cuneiform. It was a literate tradition in all senses of the word, except that it did not use the Latin alphabet, which is apparently the only writing system that Western historiography has been willing to recognize as legitimate. This systematic refusal to recognize Indigenous information systems as writing, as history, as science, as law, is one of the most consequential intellectual failures in the history of Canadian scholarship. It meant that Indigenous peoples were classified as preliterate, as people without history, as people whose knowledge was folklore rather than fact. This classification justified treating Indigenous oral traditions as legally inferior to written documents in court cases about land and treaty rights. It justified the residential school system's replacement of Indigenous knowledge, transmission with European education. It justified the anthropological enterprise of collecting Indigenous cultural artifacts for museum display rather than returning them to the communities they came from. And it fundamentally misrepresented what Indigenous peoples had actually created. Let us spend some time with the Pacific Northwest coast in more detail, because this is a civilization that has received more popular attention than most, and yet is still systematically misunderstood. The Haida Gwaii archipelago, the islands off the northern coast of British Columbia, was one of the most densely populated areas of pre-contact Indigenous Canada. The Haida people who inhabited these islands had developed, over thousands of years of relative geographic isolation, a culture of extraordinary artistic and ceremonial sophistication. Their monumental art tradition, the totem poles, house frontal poles, and mortuary poles that once lined the village waterfronts of Haida Gwaii, was the most elaborate wood-carving tradition in the world. To say that these poles were artistic achievements, while true, is also to undersell them. Each pole was a specific statement about a specific family's place in the social and cosmological order of Haida society. Every figure carved on the pole, every animal and supernatural being represented, referred to specific crests and privileges that belonged to the family that commissioned the pole. Crests were heraldic rights earned through specific ancestral encounters with supernatural beings in the mythological past, and they conferred specific privileges in Haida, ceremonial, and social life. The right to use a specific crest was property, as real and as legally significant as any property recognized in European law. The potlatch ceremonies at which poles were raised, names were given, and crests were validated were legal proceedings in the Haida system. They were the context in which transfers of property, titles, and rights were publicly witnessed, affirmed, and recorded in the memories of all those present. In a society without paper documents, the public ceremonial witness was the legal record. Everyone who attended a potlatch was a witness to the legal transactions performed there, and could be called upon to testify to what they had witnessed in any subsequent dispute. The Canadian government that outlawed the potlatch in 1885 was not outlawing a primitive feast. It was outlawing a legal system. It was making the Indigenous legal system illegal on its own territory. The consequences of this for Indigenous communities are difficult to fully measure. Property disputes that would have been resolved through potlatch ceremony became intractable. Transfer of rights and titles that would have been validated through ceremonial witness became legally ambiguous. Families lost access to crests and privileges that were never properly transferred because the ceremonies needed to transfer them were prohibited. The legal confusion created by the potlatch ban is still generating disputes that are only now, after the ban was lifted and the ceremonies resumed, beginning to be resolved through the traditional system. The scale of what the Pacific Northwest Coast cultures built in their material culture is staggering when you look at it. Honestly, the great plank houses of the Kwakwaka Wakf and the Tsimshian were not simple shelters. They were enormous, permanent structures, some of them 30 meters long and 15 meters wide, framed in massive cedar beams and planks split from ancient trees with stone tools and wedges and the physical labor of many people working together. The fronts of these houses were painted with the crest designs of the owning family. The interior house posts were carved with the family's mythological history. The house was a statement about who you were, where you came from, and what rights you held in the cosmological order. The villages that these houses formed were permanent settlements, not seasonal camps. The middens that surround them, the accumulated debris of thousands of years of daily life, show continuous occupation at specific sites, going back millennia. Ozette, a Makah village on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, was buried by a mudslide around 500 years ago and excavated in the 1970s with results that stunned archaeologists. The preservation was extraordinary, and what it revealed was a community of substantial, well-built houses with thousands of artifacts revealing a material culture of remarkable sophistication. This was a standard Northwest Coast village, not an exceptional one. Dozens of its neighbors along the coast would have looked similar. The wealth of the Pacific coast was not accidental. It was managed. The salmon runs that were the foundation of the coastal economy were carefully stewarded. The Tsimshian had ceremonies marking the first salmon of the run, ceremonially returning the bones of the first fish to the river to ensure the run would return. These ceremonies were not superstition. They were conservation practice, embedded in ceremonial form to ensure compliance across generations. The taboos associated with the salmon runs against waste, against pollution, against overharvesting had the same function as modern fisheries regulations. They were resource management rules made memorable and enforceable through their ceremonial context. The Ulachon fishery of the northwest coast was another managed resource that supported a continental trade network. Ulachon, the little candlefish so rich in oil that a dried specimen can be lit and burned like a candle, was rendered into grease that was one of the most prized trade goods in the interior of British Columbia and Alberta. The grease trails, the overland trade routes by which Ulachon grease was carried from the coast to the interior, were among the most important trade highways in pre-contact Western Canada. They are called grease trails still today. The communities that controlled access to the Ulachon fishery controlled one of the most valuable commodities in the Western Canadian trade system. Moving inland from the coast into the plateau region of what is now interior British Columbia and southern Alberta, we encounter cultures that combined elements of the Pacific coast tradition with adaptations to a different and more demanding environment. The Nlaka'pamux, the Secwepemc, the Syils, the Tsilhqot'in, and the many other nations of the British Columbia. Interior developed sophisticated salmon fisheries at the major river systems, particularly the Fraser and the Thompson, where the salmon runs that were returning from the Pacific could be harvested at natural bottlenecks. The pit house villages of the interior plateau, semi-subterranean structures entered through the roof by means of a notched log ladder, were winter settlements that could house hundreds of people. They are one of the most thermally efficient dwelling designs in the archaeological record, sunk into the earth to exploit the constant temperature of the ground as insulation, covered with a thick layer of packed earth on the roof and sides. A pit house in the interior of British Columbia in January, with a small fire burning inside and a family of 5 or 6 generating body heat, would maintain a comfortable interior temperature while outside temperatures dropped to -30 or below. Around these pit house villages, the landscape was managed for food production. Root vegetables, particularly the camas lily, were cultivated in what amounts to large-scale horticulture. Camas meadows were burned on a regular schedule to maintain their productivity and suppress the encroachment of woody vegetation. Fishing weirs and traps on the rivers were constructed and maintained across generations, requiring periodic rebuilding and the kind of collective labor that implies community governance and resource management protocols. When the smallpox epidemic swept through the British Columbia interior in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, often arriving before any direct European contact, it killed so many of the people managing these landscapes that the managed systems collapsed. The camas meadows grew over as burning schedules were abandoned. The fishing weirs decayed. The pit house villages were abandoned, and the Europeans who arrived shortly after found what appeared to them to be a barely inhabited land of wilderness, not understanding that they were looking at the aftermath of a demographic catastrophe. David Thompson, the explorer and cartographer who traveled extensively through the Columbia River system in the early 19th century, encountered the wreckage of this epidemic on several occasions. He found villages where the houses were standing, but the people were gone, their bones scattered inside the structures. He found populations so reduced that communities that had once numbered hundreds had been reduced to handfuls of survivors. He noted this in his journals. He understood that the land had been much more populated than it appeared when he arrived. His understanding did not shape the official history. The official history told the story of exploration and settlement as if the land had always been as Thompson found it after the epidemic, as if the empty villages and reduced populations were the baseline condition, rather than the aftermath of catastrophe. In the eastern part of the country, the Mi'kmaq of what is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec were among the first Indigenous peoples on the eastern seaboard to encounter sustained European contact. The Mi'kmaq had been fishing the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the Bay of Fundy for thousands of years when the Basque and Breton fishermen who preceded any official European exploration began using the eastern shores of Canada as a seasonal base. The Mi'kmaq traded with these fishermen informally for decades before any formal diplomatic relationship was established. The Mi'kmaq were organized in a district system, with each district governed by a local chief and represented in a grand council that brought together the leaders of all the Mi'kmaq districts. This grand council, the Sante Maui-Omi, was the supreme political authority of the Mi'kmaq nation. It negotiated treaties, adjudicated disputes between districts, and coordinated responses to external threats. It was, by any reasonable standard, a functioning democratic institution. The Concordat of 1610 between the Mi'kmaq and France, in which the Mi'kmaq entered into a formal alliance with the French crown while maintaining their political sovereignty, was a treaty between nations. The series of treaties known as the Peace and Friendship Treaties, negotiated between the Mi'kmaq and the British Crown between 1725 and 1779, were also treaties between sovereign nations. In these treaties, the Mi'kmaq did not surrender their land. They agreed to certain terms of coexistence with British settlers while maintaining their rights to their traditional territories and their traditional ways of life. The British and later Canadian governments did not honor these treaties. The Mi'kmaq were progressively dispossessed of their territory through a combination of direct confiscation, encroachment by settlers, and legal manipulations that the Mi'kmaq had no effective way to contest in a court system operating under British legal principles they had not agreed to and had no voice in. But the treaties themselves never went away. They were there in the records, in the British colonial archives, preserved in the Wampum records of the Mi'kmaq, maintained in the oral tradition of Mi'kmaq. Communities who never stopped asserting their rights, and in 1999, the Supreme Court of Canada, in the Marshall decision, confirmed that the peace and friendship treaties were valid and enforceable, and that they guaranteed the Mi'kmaq the right to earn a moderate livelihood from the fisheries they had fished for thousands of years. The Marshall decision did not restore everything that was taken. Nothing can do that. But it confirmed the legal reality of something the Mi'kmaq had been saying for centuries, that their rights existed before Canada, that they were not given by Canada and could not be taken away by Canada, that the civilization that was here before this country arrived had a legal and political existence that this country is still obligated to reckon with. The James Bay Cree of northern Quebec offer another example of the long arc of this reckoning. When the Quebec government announced the James Bay hydroelectric project in the early 1970s, one of the largest hydroelectric projects in the world, it did not consult the Cree communities whose territory would be flooded. It proceeded as if those communities did not exist, or existed only as subjects of Canadian jurisdiction with no rights worth consulting. The Cree took the government to court, arguing that their Aboriginal title to the territory gave them rights that the project violated. The resulting legal battle produced the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement of 1975, the first modern land claim settlement in Canadian history. The Cree did not win everything they wanted. They compromised significantly. But the agreement was a recognition, however imperfect, that the Cree had rights in their territory that predated the Quebec government's claim to it, that those rights had not been extinguished, and that the development of that territory required the consent and participation of the people who had inhabited it for millennia. The agreement also established the Cree governance structures that have since evolved into one of the most sophisticated Indigenous self-governance systems in Canada. The Cree Nation of Iyu Ishji administers health, education, economic development, and local governance for thousands of Cree people across a territory larger than many countries. They are doing what the people of this land have always done, governing themselves, managing their resources, maintaining their culture, building the future of their communities. The deep history of this land is not separate from these contemporary struggles. It is the foundation of them. The Cree assertion of rights over James Bay rests on thousands of years of continuous habitation and management of that territory. The Mi'kmaq assertion of fishing rights rests on thousands of years of fishing the same waters. The Haudenosaunee assertion of sovereignty over their traditional territory rests on the great law of peace that governed that territory long before Canada existed. Every land claim, every treaty case, every assertion of Indigenous rights in Canadian courts, every argument for self-governance, every demand for recognition of Indigenous political authority. They all rest on the same foundation, the fact that there were civilizations here before Canada, civilizations of depth and sophistication and legitimate political authority, civilizations that were deliberately targeted for destruction, but that survived, that persisted, that maintained enough of their legal and historical continuity to assert rights that no amount of erasure could fully eliminate. The Wet'suwet'en of northern British Columbia have been in the news in recent years because of their resistance to pipeline construction through their unceded traditional territory. Their claim is not complicated. Their ancestors inhabited that territory for thousands of years. They never signed a treaty with Canada. Their title to that land was never legally extinguished. The Supreme Court of Canada confirmed in Delgamuukw that Aboriginal title of this kind exists and has legal weight. And yet the pipelines were being built through their territory without their consent. The hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en, the traditional governance system that predates Canadian jurisdiction by centuries, blocked the pipeline. Canadian police were sent to remove them. Dozens of people were arrested. The conflict generated international attention and revealed in a concentrated form the ongoing tension between the legal fictions on which Canadian sovereignty was built and the stubborn persistence of the civilizations that Canadian sovereignty tried to replace. The deep history is present in that conflict. The knowledge that the Wet'suwet'en have of their territory, accumulated over generations, encoded in their language and their oral tradition, is not irrelevant to questions about how that territory should be managed. The governance system that determines who has authority to make decisions about that territory is not a recent invention. It is a very old institution with its own rules and its own legitimacy. Canada is a young country with a very old problem. It was built on a lie that the land was empty, that the people who lived here were primitive, that what they had created was not civilization and not worthy of respect or legal recognition. That lie has consequences that are still unfolding. Every generation of Canadians has to decide how to respond to it, and the response shapes the country. The honest response begins with knowing the full truth of what was here before Canada. The Hopewell traders carrying copper from Lake Superior to the burial mounds of Ohio. The Wendat farmers managing their longhouse villages and their agricultural fields in Georgian Bay. The Haudenosaunee Confederates gathering under the great tree of peace to debate and decide the laws that govern their nations. The Anishinaabe paddling their birch bark canoes through the wild rice beds of the Great Lakes. The Plains Cree reading the behavior of the bison herds with a knowledge accumulated over centuries. The Haida carvers raising poles to record their history and assert their rights in the visual language of Northwest Coast art. The Thule hunters reading the sea ice for the signs that would guide them to the breathing holes of the ringed seal. The Mi'kmaq fishermen in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, who had been fishing those waters for thousands of years before any European knew those waters existed. This is who was here. This is what they built. This is what was deliberately, systematically, and very nearly successfully erased. The mounds are still there. The wampum belts are still in the archives and the councils of the Haudenosaunee. The great law of peace is still being practiced. The birch bark scrolls of the Midewiwin are still being read by those who know how to read them. The poles are still being carved. The songs are still being sung. Before Canada, there was a world of 10,000 years of human civilization in a land of extraordinary richness, managed by peoples of extraordinary knowledge and creativity. That world was covered over. It was buried under residential schools and Indian acts and smallpox blankets and the simply overwhelming demographic weight of European settlement. But it was not destroyed. It endures. In communities across this country, in the faces and languages and ceremonies and legal arguments and political assertions of the peoples who were here first and are here still, it endures. Canada has a choice about what to do with that endurance. It can continue to ignore it, to minimize it, to treat it as an inconvenience in the management of a modern state, or it can recognize it for what it is, the foundation of this land's human story, a 10,000-year heritage of knowledge and civilization that belongs to everyone who lives here now, and that the country can either continue to bury or finally, honestly, begin to honor. The choice belongs to everyone who considers themselves Canadian. It belongs to everyone who lives on this land that was never empty, in this country that was built on top of something much older, much deeper, and much more remarkable than the founding mythology ever admitted. The civilization was real. The erasure was real. And the survival is real. What Canada does with that truth is the question that will define what kind of country it actually is. To close this documentary, it is worth spending a moment on what has been deliberately left out of the history of this land and why that omission matters beyond the merely academic. The Canadian school system, for most of its history, taught Canadian children that the country began with European contact. Indigenous peoples appeared in these histories as context, as background, as part of the environment that European explorers and settlers encountered. They were not presented as having histories of their own, histories that predated European arrival by thousands of years, and that constituted, by any honest measure, civilizations of the first order. This is not a matter of historical controversy. The evidence is clear and has been clear for decades to anyone willing to look at it. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was practicing representative democracy under a written constitution when the concept of representative democracy was still contested in Europe. The agricultural peoples of southern Ontario were managing food systems of greater caloric efficiency and ecological sustainability than anything European agriculture had yet developed. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the medicine wheels of the Alberta plains was precise enough to function as a calendar that still works today. The birch bark canoe was more efficient, more adaptable, and more repairable in field conditions than any small watercraft that European shipwrights had produced. None of this was unknown. All of it was documented by the Europeans who encountered it, in journals, in diplomatic records, in missionary reports, in administrative correspondence. The knowledge was there. The decision not to teach it, not to incorporate it into the national story, was a choice. It was a choice made in service of a particular narrative about Canadian identity, a narrative that required Indigenous peoples to be primitive in order for the colonial enterprise to be justified. That narrative is false. The choice to maintain it is an ongoing one. Every generation of Canadians and every institution that shapes how Canadians understand their history makes that choice again. The truth and reconciliation. Commission's calls to action include specific requirements about how Canadian history should be taught, specifically that the history of residential schools, the history of Indigenous peoples, and the history of treaty relationships be incorporated into educational curricula at every level. These are not calls for the inclusion of supplementary material in an otherwise intact curriculum. They are calls for a fundamental rethinking of what Canadian history is and whose history it includes. The land on which Canada sits has been inhabited by complex, sophisticated, politically organized human civilizations for at least 14,000 years, possibly much longer. The people who built those civilizations are still here. Their legal and historical claims to their territories have survived everything done to suppress them. Their knowledge systems, damaged but not destroyed, are being revitalized by communities that refuse to accept the finality of their erasure. Before Canada, there was a world. That world has never fully ended, and its story is the oldest, deepest, and most important story this land has to tell.